Here's what happens when your tenant stops paying rent like mine did. There's one question I get all the time. What if your tenant stops paying rent and after owning 22 properties, it's finally happened to me? So in this video, I'm sharing the full story, why they stopped paying, how I took them to court, how much money I lost, and what I'm doing to stop it from happening again. So if you followed me long enough, especially on Instagram, you'll know I've said this loads of times that tenants not paying isn't as common as people think or make it out to be. And I'll say that because it never happened to me. I mean, I've got 22 properties now, never had a tenant miss payment. But at the same time, I've always made it clear that up to now, I've probably been a bit lucky. And I've always said this as well, that it was only a matter of time till someone stops paying me rent. And now it's happened. So let's rewind to the start. So I bought this 2-bedroom bungalow back in December 2022 for £78,000 in the northeast. It was a tired property that needed a full refurb, a proper refurb. I can't remember the exact reason, but there was a delay to get started on the refurb on that property. I can't remember now, but when we did eventually get the refurb going, it was relatively straightforward. You know, your standard refurb, nothing fancy, and the whole refurb cost £18,000. And then once it was completed, the original plan was, at the time, was to do what I've always done, which was to let it out as a buy-to-let. But by the time the refurb was complete, it was in the middle of 2023 when the interest rates, they started to rise fast and the numbers on that buy-to-let became tight. So what I did was I decided to test this property out as a service accommodation because I have a deal sourcing business, and at the time we started doing this for our investors, our clients, and they were having, you know, relative success to it compared to a buy-to-let. So I thought, okay, it seems to be working, we've got enough data, let's give this a go. So that was going to be my first service accommodation trial. That property was almost like a guinea pig for service accommodation, and I thought if this went well, I could continue doing more of these. Anyways, we got some furniture, we got the appliances, we gave it obviously the refurb. We basically made the property become suitable for Airbnb. And for the last 5 months of 2023, when it was running as a service accommodation, it actually did quite all right. It pulled in just over £4,000 in cash flow, so that's my pure profit after all of the, you know, the mortgage, the bills, everything else. And to be honest, I was kind of skeptical of whether this is going to work, but you know, the fact that I had some data from my investor clients, it made me more confident. But I still was not sure how this particular property was gonna, you know, fare, because at the end of the day, I didn't buy it with having an essay in mind. I just bought a property which was going to be a buy-to-let. So started off great, but just like the nature of, you know, typical short-term rental businesses, what happened was the first few months of 2024, they were very unpredictable. So that was in January, February, and I think it's March. It was up and down, right? It was unpredictable. I was still cash flow positive, but it wasn't, I had made £4,000. I can't remember now top of the head, but it was, let's just say it was half of that profit. Still better than a buy-to-let, but for a service accommodation and for all of the work that went into it, it was almost like, yeah, it was okay. It wasn't nothing brilliant. And I was like, if I just put that much effort into my sourcing business, I couldn't make more money. So I wasn't really keen on the idea of service accommodation, even though it works for most people depending on the goal. And because of the unpredictability, and also combined with the fact that at the time I had paid this property in cash and I still hadn't refinanced it, because, you know, I didn't know whether I was going to stick to service accommodation or I was going to turn it back to a buy-to-let. So that way I kept my options open by paying in cash because I didn't have a mortgage. So I thought, you know what, I've got quite a lot of money stuck in this property. I'm going to convert it back to a buy-to-let, put in a buy-to-let mortgage. Yes, the cash flow won't be high, but with that money I'm going to pull out, I can reinvest into other properties. So I turned it back to a buy-to-let. So I turned it back into a buy-to-let, got a first tenant in, no issues at all. They stayed for 6 months, paid on time, is super smooth, just like most buy-to-lets are. Then the second tenant came in again for the first 6 months, no problems at all. But then came January this year in 2025, and I get a call from my lettings manager, and he basically said, VJ, we might have a problem. And then he explained to me that the tenant hadn't paid for the first month and they were basically not as responsive. Now, when someone misses a rent payment, usually, from my experience, usually it gets sorted out pretty quickly. But this time, no rent in January, nothing in February, and that's when I knew that this property was different. And the reason why I could say that is because I've never had any of my tenants miss 2 payments in a row. And that's when we knew, okay, this tenant has stopped paying rent, and it's most likely because they weren't responsive, they're gonna continue to do this. So my lettings manager was dealing with all of this in the background, right? And he was just updating me. And to be fair to him, he was great though. I cannot fault him. And it turns out that at that property, there was a couple living there. There's a young couple living in there, and they had split up. The boyfriend, he packed up all his stuff, he'd moved to London, and that meant she was staying at the property on her own, and she just couldn't afford the rent anymore. But the problem is, she didn't say anything, she didn't message, she didn't explain, she stopped answering the calls, and basically just stopped paying rent. Now, to be fair, she didn't trash the whole property, but what she did do was play the system pretty well. She lived there for 7 months rent-free, and if you ask me, she knew exactly what she was doing, right? She knew all the rules and regulations, because every few days she would say to my lettings manager, she would say, yeah, I'm going to move out, I'll drop the keys off soon, you know. But it just became one excuse after other. And my lettings manager, he manages hundreds of properties, and he knew this was from the typical playbook of just not want to pay the rent and playing the system. And the problem with all this is, because of the rules, we couldn't really do anything until she was 2 months behind. When she became 2 months behind in rent, we served a section 8, took her to court, got possession back, right? It was a whole lengthy process, but to be fair, I didn't get involved in it much. But then the reality is, by the time we took her to court, and by the time we was able to get the property back, the damage was already done. And if you look at how much I lost, so at the time the property was rented out for £650 a month. Because they didn't pay 7 months of rent, if you just times that by 7, that was £4,550 rent gone, right? I had lost. I still had to pay the mortgage, which was £358.73 to be precise a month, which comes to £2,511.11. So I lost the 4,000 in rent. The mortgage payment I was still paying out of my own pocket, so that was like a net loss as well. And then of course we had to take him to court. The court case, it cost me, and I didn't know it was going to be that expensive, but it cost me £2,047. Okay, so all in, this one tenant in one property cost me £9,000 for the whole 7 months, right? And realistically, this is the kind of, I've lost out on 2 years of cash flow. And the thing is, and the frustrating thing was that this, property was a good property. It was risk-free on paper. It was in a decent area. This was a solid property at the start, and I still lost money. Now, I'm not looking for sympathy, right? These things, happen. It could have been worse. They could have just trashed up the property, and then I would have had to pay more to get the property fixed. And because I've heard some horror stories of their properties getting trashed, I kind of got away with it. But at the same time, I still lost out on £9,000, which wasn't my fault. And no one likes losing £9,000, right? But anyways, once we got the property, we were able to get a tenant in pretty quickly, which was probably the only positive out of this whole situation. Because the reality is, when you lose money, when there's, stress behind it and time, there's never really a happy ending. And this one was one of those. And I feel like the reality is, landlords get a bad name, but some tenants do take the piss, like this one did. She knew she wasn't paying. She knew she was going to stay for free. And let's be honest, if I walked into Tesco and left with £4,000 worth of stuff, I'd be arrested, right? Because it's rent, because it's greedy landlords, right? No one cares. And here's the thing, I had actually been thinking about rent insurance for a while, because I knew that the more properties I buy, the more chances I'm going to have of tenants not paying rent, because ultimately it's a numbers game. But insurance is one of those things, isn't it, that you, especially for me, I'll say I'll do it and I never got around to doing it. So because you always tell yourself, it's fine, it's never happened to me so far, then you start doing the maths and you think it's not worth it. But this has changed my mind now, because you don't just lose out on the rent, you lose the mortgage money, you lose time, you also lose some of your sanity, and of course you lose future income, because until you get the property back, you can't put another tenant in. So what am I doing differently now? I just bought my 21st and 22nd properties. Both of them now will have rent guarantee insurance from day one, and any tenant renewals going forward for my previous property, we're adding it in. And yeah, yeah, I'll make a little less per property, but the size of my property now, it would get tricky if more and more tenants start trying it on. And of course, this is my own fault, and there's always pros and cons, but because I have a social media presence, I feel like it would only take one tenant to look at my videos and think, oh, he's making loads of money, we don't need to pay him. So this just protects from all of the possible, you know, problems that will eventually happen if I don't get rent insurance, because this way at least I'm protected. Yes, I'm gonna make about £25 a month less, but at least that way I can sleep at night, because in property, defense is just as important as offense. So if you've ever asked what happens if a tenant stops paying rent, here's the answer. It will cost you thousands, even when the deal looks perfect on paper. That's why, for me, I feel like it's time to, you know, step it up a little and finally get rent insurance. And for you, if you've just been thinking about, you know, what will happen if a tenant trashes my place or stops paying rent, the rent insurance will cover these things, because right now it's not even so much I live in fear or to live in fear. It's about protection, isn't it? And if you want to know what other mistakes to avoid in property, especially as a beginner, go check out my video called How to Avoid These 5 Rookie Mistakes. It'll save you more money than this one ever cost me. I'll see you over there.